The Great Depression didn't have to last a decade. This is perhaps the most important and least understood fact about the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. The initial crash in 1929 and the recession that followed were severe, but not unprecedented. America had experienced sharp downturns before and recovered relatively quickly, as we saw with the 1920-21 depression. But something different happened in the 1930s. The economy not only failed to recover, but actually got worse for years. Unemployment remained above 15% for the entire decade, didn't fall below 10% until 1941, when war production finally pulled the economy out. Industrial production collapsed by nearly half and took years to recover even partially. And the human suffering was immense and prolonged. An entire generation grew up in poverty. Millions were unemployed for years. Malnutrition was widespread. The social fabric frayed. And all of this happened not because the initial shock was uniquely severe, but because policy responses were uniquely bad. A combination of ideology, institutional constraints, and political failure turned what should have been a sharp but manageable recession into a grinding decade-long depression. And the specific policy error that explains most of this prolonged misery was the commitment to the gold standard, a monetary system that forced countries to deflate their economies, destroy their banking systems, and impoverish their populations in service of maintaining a fixed exchange rate with gold. This was the real reason the depression lasted so long. Not the stock market crash, not overproduction, not inequality, although all of those contributed, but the choice, and it was a choice, to maintain the gold standard long after it had become obvious that doing so was catastrophic. The gold standard seems archaic now, a relic of the 19th century that nobody takes seriously. But in the 1920s and early 1930s, it was economic orthodoxy, the foundation of international finance, the system that supposedly provided stability and prevented government from debasing currency. Here's how it worked. Countries agreed to convert their currency to gold at a fixed rate. The U.S. promised to exchange $20.67 for an ounce of gold. Britain promised 4.86 pounds per ounce, and so on. And because these rates were fixed, exchange rates between currencies were also fixed. This meant you could trade internationally without worrying about currency fluctuations. You knew how many dollars a pound was worth because both were defined in terms of gold, and the system had a built-in adjustment mechanism. If a country imported more than it exported, gold would flow out to pay for the imports. This would reduce the money supply because money was backed by gold. Reducing the money supply would cause deflation, making that country's goods cheaper and more competitive, restoring balance. Conversely, countries with trade surpluses would see gold flow in, expanding their money supply, causing inflation, making their goods less competitive. It was supposed to be automatic, self-correcting, requiring no discretionary policy. The gold standard would maintain equilibrium and prevent inflation, and everything would work beautifully. Except it didn't work beautifully at all. It worked terribly. And when the depression hit, it turned a crisis into a catastrophe. The problem with the gold standard in the 1930s was that the adjustment mechanism worked backwards. Instead of deflation restoring competitiveness and growth, it created a death spiral. When the American economy contracted after 1929, people lost confidence in banks and the economy. They withdrew deposits and hoarded cash or gold. This caused bank failures, which reduced the money supply, which caused deflation. Falling prices meant debtors couldn't pay their debts, which caused more bank failures, more deflation. Falling prices also meant businesses cut production and workers because they couldn't sell goods at profitable prices, which increased unemployment, which reduced spending, which caused more deflation. And through all of this, the Federal Reserve, constrained by the need to maintain gold convertibility, couldn't expand the money supply to stop the deflation. Because expanding the money supply without a corresponding increase in gold reserves would threaten the gold standard, might cause a run on gold as people tried to convert dollars to gold before the government abandoned convertibility. So the Fed actually allowed the money supply to contract by a third from 1929 to 1933, the most catastrophic monetary policy failure in American history, destroying the banking system and ensuring the depression would be severe and prolonged. And they did this not because they were stupid, but because they were committed to the gold standard, which they believed was more important than the economy itself. The international dimension made everything worse because the gold standard was a global system, problems transmitted across borders with mechanical efficiency. When the U.S. economy contracted, Americans imported less, which hurt foreign exporters, which caused their economies to contract, which caused them to import less from America and other countries, creating a synchronized global downturn. And then countries responded by trying to protect themselves, raising tariffs to reduce imports and preserve gold reserves. But when everyone raises tariffs simultaneously, international trade collapses, which it did, falling by about two-thirds from 1929 to 1933, the worst collapse in modern history. And this trade collapse turned national recessions into a global depression, and the gold standard made this transmission mechanism far more powerful than it would have been under floating exchange rates. Because countries couldn't devalue their currencies to restore competitiveness, they couldn't pursue independent monetary policies to support their economies. They were locked into a system that forced them to deflate together, to race to the bottom, competing to cut wages and prices faster than their trading partners, trying to gain competitive advantage through immiseration. And the result was that everyone got poorer together, global output collapsed, unemployment soared everywhere, and the social and political consequences would include the rise of fascism and eventually World War II, all because the major economies refused to abandon a monetary system that clearly wasn't working. The empirical evidence on this is overwhelming and comes from economist Barry Eichengreen and others who studied when different countries left the gold standard and how their economies performed. The pattern is stark and consistent. Countries that abandoned gold early recovered early. Countries that stayed on gold longer had deeper and longer depressions. Britain left gold in September 1931, after a banking crisis made maintaining convertibility impossible, and the British economy immediately began recovering. GDP growth turned positive. Unemployment began falling. Within a few years, Britain had recovered most of what it lost. Meanwhile, France, which clung to gold until 1936, had a depression that was nearly as deep and lasted longer than America's. The same pattern held across dozens of countries. Scandinavia left gold early and recovered early. The gold bloc countries of France, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland stayed on gold until the mid-1930s and suffered accordingly. Japan left gold early and recovered strongly. Even Latin American countries that abandoned gold or never had it in the first place recovered faster than the core industrial economies that stayed on gold. This wasn't coincidence or cultural difference. It was monetary policy. Countries that freed themselves from the gold standard constraint could expand their money supplies, could stop deflation, could support their banking systems, could pursue policies that maintained employment and output, while countries chained to gold had to accept deflation and depression as the price of monetary orthodoxy. The United States stayed on gold until 1933, longer than Britain but not as long as France, and even after Roosevelt took office in March 1933 and eventually abandoned gold conversion. The dollar remained partially tied to gold with restrictions. Full abandonment didn't come until 1934, and the recovery, while significant once gold was abandoned, was incomplete and interrupted by the 1937-38 recession when Roosevelt, worried about the deficit and inflation, tried to balance the budget and the Fed tightened policy prematurely. So American unemployment remained high throughout the decade, never falling below 10% until 1941. And this prolonged unemployment wasn't because the economy couldn't recover. It was because policy kept stepping on the brakes every time recovery started. The commitment to balanced budgets, the fear of inflation even when prices were still falling, the concern about government debt even when the private sector was paralyzed, all of these ideological commitments prevented the kind of sustained aggressive stimulus that would have been needed to restore full employment. But even this partial recovery after leaving gold was dramatic enough to prove the point. From 1933 to 1937, before the premature tightening, GDP grew at double-digit annual rates. Unemployment fell from 25% to under 15%. Industrial production recovered substantially. This was all enabled by leaving gold and allowing monetary expansion, and if policy had stayed expansionary instead of tightening in 1937, the Depression likely would have ended years earlier. Full employment would have been restored by 1940 instead of requiring World War II. The question is why? If the gold standard was so clearly making things worse, if abandoning it produced such obvious benefits, Why did countries cling to it for so long? And the answer involves ideology, institutions, and political economy. First, the gold standard was seen as the foundation of financial respectability. Abandoning it was viewed as a form of default, an admission that your country couldn't manage its affairs. In the 19th century, Britain had maintained gold convertibility through wars and crises, and this was seen as a source of strength and prestige. Countries that left gold were seen as weak or corrupt, unable to maintain discipline. So there was enormous stigma attached to leaving gold. Political leaders who even suggested it risked being seen as irresponsible. Second, the gold standard served the interests of creditors, of people who had lent money or held bonds, because deflation increased the real value of debt. If you lent $100 and got paid back $100, but prices had fallen 30%, you were getting back purchasing power equivalent to $130. This was great for creditors, but terrible for debtors, who saw the real burden of their debts increase even as their incomes fell. And in the political economy of the 1930s, creditors had more power than debtors, banks, bondholders, wealthy individuals. They had the ear of policymakers. They funded political campaigns. They controlled media, so policy was made to protect their interests, even when those interests conflicted with broad economic recovery. Third, there was a genuine belief, particularly in central banking circles and among economists, that the gold standard was necessary to prevent inflation and maintain confidence. These weren't cynical people protecting class interests, although some were. Many were sincere believers in gold standard orthodoxy. They thought that abandoning gold would lead to currency collapse and hyperinflation, like Weimar Germany. They thought that maintaining gold convertibility was the only thing preserving confidence in the currency and the banking system, and they feared that any deviation would trigger a run on gold and force an even more catastrophic devaluation. So they held on, even as unemployment rose, even as banks failed, even as the economy collapsed. They held on because they believed that abandoning gold would be even worse, and this belief persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary, despite the fact that countries leaving gold were recovering while those staying on it continued to suffer. Ideology is powerful. It allows people to ignore evidence that contradicts their priors, and the ideology of the gold standard was particularly powerful because it had worked, more or less, for decades before World War I. It had provided stability and growth and facilitated international trade, so the people who believed in it had experience to support their belief. They just failed to recognize that the world had changed, that the interwar gold standard was different from the pre-war system, that trying to restore what had existed before was impossible and counterproductive. The structural problem with the interwar gold standard was how it had been restored. During World War I, most countries suspended gold convertibility to finance war spending. After the war, there was a consensus that gold should be restored. But at what rates? Britain made the catastrophic decision to return to gold at the pre-war parity, which meant the pound was significantly overvalued, making British exports uncompetitive and forcing deflation. To try to restore competitiveness, France went back to gold at an undervalued rate, making French exports cheap and causing gold to flow to France. The United States emerged from the war with enormous gold reserves and a strong currency. But instead of allowing this to cause inflation that would help rebalance, the Fed sterilized the gold inflows, preventing the adjustment mechanism from working. So the system started the 1920s badly imbalanced, with gold distributed unevenly, with some currencies overvalued and others undervalued, with the adjustment mechanisms not working properly. And these imbalances made the system fragile. When the shock of the Depression hit, the system couldn't absorb it. Instead, it amplified it, transmitting and magnifying the downturn across all countries on gold. The alternative to gold was floating exchange rates and independent monetary policies, allowing currencies to fluctuate based on economic conditions, allowing central banks to expand money supplies without worrying about gold convertibility. This seems obvious now, but in the 1930s it was seen as dangerous, as inviting competitive devaluations where countries would race to devalue their currencies to gain export advantages. And this did happen to some extent, but the feared currency chaos never materialized. What actually happened was that countries that left gold and pursued expansionary monetary policies recovered. Countries that didn't stay depressed. The benefits of leaving gold far outweighed the costs of currency instability, and in fact, the currency instability was modest compared to the economic catastrophe of staying on gold. This was the great lesson of the Depression, that monetary sovereignty, the ability to control your own money supply and pursue policies appropriate to your economic conditions, was more important than fixed exchange rates, that the supposed stability of gold was illusory if maintaining it required destroying your economy. Yet this lesson had to be learned through years of suffering, because the people in power were so committed to the old system that they couldn't or wouldn't abandon it even when it was clearly failing. The role of the Federal Reserve in prolonging the Depression through its commitment to gold cannot be overstated. The Fed was created in 1913 partly to prevent financial panics by serving as a lender of last resort. But when the banking crisis hit in the early 1930s, the Fed failed to perform this function. It allowed thousands of banks to fail, taking depositors' savings and destroying the money supply. And the reason was its commitment to gold. The Fed believed that expanding credit to safe banks would threaten gold convertibility, would cause inflation, would undermine confidence. So it prioritized defending gold over defending banks or the economy. This was the exact opposite of what a central bank should do in a crisis, and the consequences were catastrophic. The bank failures destroyed the financial system's ability to intermediate between savers and borrowers. Companies that might have survived with access to credit failed. Workers who might have kept their jobs were laid off. The economy spiraled downward in a way that could have been prevented if the Fed had been willing to act as a lender of last resort. But it wasn't willing, not as long as gold convertibility was the priority, and this failure, this choice to defend an arbitrary fixed exchange rate rather than the real economy, extended the Depression by years and inflicted unnecessary suffering on millions. When Roosevelt finally took office in March 1933, one of his first acts was to declare a bank holiday, closing all banks temporarily to stop the panic, then reopening only those that were solvent. This stabilized the banking system almost immediately. The panic stopped. People redeposited their money. Confidence began returning. Then in April, he took the U.S. off gold for domestic purposes, allowing the dollar to float and the money supply to expand, and the economy immediately began recovering. It's hard to overstate how dramatic this turnaround was. After 4 years of unremitting decline, suddenly GDP was growing, employment was rising, prices were stabilizing. This was the power of monetary policy, of freeing the economy from the gold standard constraint, and it proved that the Depression wasn't some mysterious inevitable catastrophe. It was a policy failure, a failure that could be corrected by changing policy. Yet even Roosevelt didn't fully understand what he'd accomplished. He, still worried about inflation and deficits, he allowed a partial return to gold-linked policy with the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. He tried to balance the budget in 1937, causing the recession that interrupted recovery. The commitment to old economic orthodoxies remained strong even in the face of evidence that those orthodoxies had failed. The broader lesson about why the Depression lasted so long is about the power and danger of ideology. The people making policy decisions in the early 1930s weren't randomly incompetent. They were highly educated, experienced, dedicated public servants. But they were operating under an ideological framework that prevented them from seeing or acknowledging what was happening. The gold standard was more than just a monetary policy. It was a worldview, a set of beliefs about how economies should work, about the proper role of government, about the importance of sound money and fiscal discipline. And these beliefs were so deeply held that contradictory evidence was dismissed or rationalized away. When leaving gold produced recovery, this was explained as temporary or artificial. When staying on gold prolonged depression, this was blamed on other factors, on lack of confidence, on government intervention, on anything except the gold standard itself. And this ideological blindness extended beyond just monetary policy. The belief in balanced budgets, in austerity during depression, in allowing liquidation of businesses and banks, all of these were part of the same orthodox framework. A framework that had worked reasonably well during normal times, but was catastrophically wrong during crisis. And the people who believed in this framework couldn't or wouldn't adapt, even when their policies clearly weren't working, even when unemployment hit 25%, even when thousands of banks failed, even when international trade collapsed. They stuck to their beliefs, and millions suffered as a result. The comparison to our own era is instructive. In 2008, we faced a financial crisis that could have become another Great Depression, but didn't. Unemployment peaked at 10% rather than 25%. The recovery, while slow, began within 2 years rather than taking a decade. And the reason is that policymakers in 2008 had learned the lessons of the 1930s. They knew that the gold standard had prolonged the depression, so they pursued aggressive monetary expansion instead of allowing deflation. They knew that bank failures had destroyed the money supply, so they recapitalized banks and guaranteed deposits. They knew that fiscal austerity during depression was counterproductive, so they pursued stimulus spending, and these policies, while imperfect and insufficient in many ways, prevented a repeat of the 1930s catastrophe. We got a bad recession instead of a Great Depression, and this was entirely because of better policy. We didn't face a worse initial shock than 1929, we faced a similar shock, a financial crisis and credit collapse. But we responded better, and the difference in outcomes shows how much policy matters, how much suffering can be prevented by making better decisions. But it also shows how contingent this is on having learned the right lessons. If the people in power in 2008 had been ideological gold standard types, if they prioritized currency stability over employment, if they'd allowed widespread bank failures and deflation, we would have had another Great Depression. The 2008 response wasn't inevitable. It was the result of decades of economic research showing what had gone wrong in the 1930s and why. Research by economists like Milton Friedman, despite his other views, who showed the role of monetary contraction, Barry Eichengreen, who showed the role of the gold standard, Christina Romer, who showed the role of monetary and fiscal policy in recovery. And this research influenced the people making decisions in 2008. Ben Bernank's academic work was on the Great Depression. He understood what not to do, and that knowledge mattered. It saved us from repeating the worst mistakes of history. The tragedy of the Great Depression is that it didn't have to happen, not at that scale, not for that duration. The initial shock of 1929 was severe but manageable. What turned it into a decade-long catastrophe was a series of policy choices: the commitment to gold, the failure to rescue banks, the premature fiscal tightening. And these weren't forced by circumstances, they were choices. Choices made by people who prioritized abstract monetary principles over human welfare, who believed in the gold standard more than they believed in helping the unemployed, who thought that maintaining currency convertibility was more important than maintaining employment. And these choices had consequences: millions of lives destroyed, families broken, children who grew up malnourished and undereducated, social fabric torn, political extremism rising. All because policymakers wouldn't abandon a monetary system that clearly wasn't working. The real reason the Great Depression lasted so long wasn't the stock market crash or overproduction or any of the conventional explanations. It was the gold standard and the refusal to abandon it until enormous damage had been done. This is the lesson we must not forget: that ideology can blind us to reality, that commitment to failed systems can cause catastrophic harm, that the courage to abandon orthodoxy when it isn't working is more important than consistency or defending past decisions, and that monetary policy matters enormously. That's central. Banks have the power to prevent or prolong depressions through their policy choices, and that exercising that power wisely requires putting human welfare ahead of abstract principles. A lesson learned painfully in the 1930s, applied successfully in 2008, but always at risk of being forgotten by a new generation of policymakers seduced by the false promise of rigid rules and automatic mechanisms that supposedly eliminate the need for discretionary judgment and the messy reality that sometimes you have to break the rules to save the economy. And that dogmatic commitment to any economic system, whether gold standard or inflation targeting or any other rigid framework, will eventually encounter situations where the framework fails and must be abandoned. And the question is whether we'll have the wisdom and courage to abandon it quickly or whether we'll cling to it stubbornly, sacrificing millions of jobs and livelihoods in defense of an abstraction that long since stopped serving its purpose.